Welcome, everyone. This is Caitlin Hudgens again with the Nonprofit Leadership Alliance. I hope you enjoyed this morning's session with Dr. Lopez Littleton and Dr. Blessett. I'm really excited to have one of our friends with us yet again, Chad Nico Hugh from the YMCA of the USA. He's the Director of Diversity and Inclusion there, and I hope you have gotten a chance to watch his other on-demand session. This session, he's with us today to talk about privilege, how privilege affects both those and those without. And so, Chad, please take it away.
Sure. Thanks so much, Caitlin, and good day to everyone. It's once again an honor to be with you all to talk about this important concept of privilege. Privilege really is critical when we start thinking about this concept of advancing equity. We all know that in order to really take a deep dive into what equity means, both organizationally, institutionally, but also societally, we need to first understand this concept of privilege. So what you have here is a definition. Caitlin, can I ask you just to do me a favor and read this definition for us if you could?
Sure. Defining privilege, an unearned advantage or benefit enjoyed by members of a group, a phenomenon derived through a history of oppression of other groups. Privilege is best understood as the systematic advantage that is conferred to one group at the expense of another. Terms such as white privilege, male privilege, and heterosexual privilege make explicit the relationship between privilege and the group for whom it is intended to function.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. So this definition is just one of many. If you use the Google, our favorite tool in research here, you'll probably find quite a few others. Let me just give you a quick example of privilege. Now, because when we use the word privilege, it often connotates one dimension of diversity, which is race. Let me give you an example of male privilege. So I'd like you just to think for yourself, how many of you use Lyft or Uber? Probably most of us have utilized that. Now, I identify as male, and a part of my job in diversity inclusion at YMCA of the USA has me traveling all over the country. Sometimes due to wonderful flight delays, I find myself landing in random cities or towns that I've never been in, finding a need for a mode of transportation to get to a hotel that I've never been in, down a road I've never been in. One time, I was speaking to a female-identified colleague, and she was explaining to me where she was going. And my response to her was, "What's okay? Even if you land at midnight, just take an Uber or take a Lyft." She looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Chad, you need to check your male privilege." Now, I'll be honest, in that context, I looked like a deer in headlights. I thought to myself, perhaps I should quit my job in diversity inclusion because clearly I don't know the first thing about privilege. And my response, which I will admit on retrospect was quite ignorant, was to say something to this effect. We'll call my colleague Donna for a second. I said, "Donna, well, but if you take an Uber, they'll send you an email, right? You'll know what the car looks like and what the person looks like, and everything will be fine." And she said, "Chad, as a woman, I'm not going to get into someone's personal vehicle in a city or a town that I've never been in at any hour of the day, never mind when it's dark, go down a road I've never traveled to, a hotel I've never been to, and any email, no matter how pretty the picture of the car or the driver, is going to take away the need that I need to focus on, which is that I am a woman and you are male privileging all over me," she said. Wow. Talk about a wake-up call. That story is one example of the definition that Caitlin just described here. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, great, so what does this concept of privilege have to do with equity? Or what does it have to do with diversity? All of us, if we take a step back and think, have been in a situation where we were a member of the majority of some dimension of diversity, and where we were a member of the minority of some dimension of diversity. Okay. For example, I know that in many instances, working in the YMCA as a male or a male-identified individual, I am in the minority. But because our society is structured in such a way that is clearly male-dominated, including the nonprofit sector, including the YMCA, especially in our leadership, I need to recognize that although I may be in the minority, I still have male privilege that I need to recognize and check, because it does influence the lens through which I see, I lead, I interact, and therefore the lens through which I engage as an organizational change agent or organizational leader in my quest to advance equity for all. I hope that makes sense for everyone. Privilege. Now, we talked about dimensions of diversity, and for those of you that may have checked out the virtual on-demand workshop that I offered, I think it was yesterday, please feel free to check out that workshop to get a deeper dive into this wheel. I'm just going to leave it up here, say two things about it. One is this is a framework that is not perfect, but it's meant to simply help expand our minds to think about the multiple dimensions of diversity in the context of this session, where we all may experience privilege or where we all may experience not having privilege. Okay? So, for example, we talked about gender or gender identity privilege. Let's talk briefly about privilege related to race and ethnicity. Now, if you have seen the photo or headshot of myself, I look like I'm an Asian American male. I'm born and raised in Honolulu, Hawaii. And for those of you that either may be from Hawaii or have visited Hawaii, if there is a racial or ethnic majority, it is people that look like me, Asian Pacific Islanders. So from the age of 1 all the way up until I was 18, I had the benefit of growing up and living in a space where I was a member of the racial or ethnic majority. Though it could be argued that in the context of the United States more broadly, I was still a minority and thus did not have racial privilege, I would tell you that from my lens, and from my personal experience, growing up as a member of the Asian Pacific Islander community in Hawaii, being in the racial majority in Hawaii, I did have privilege related to my racial and ethnic identity. Why do I think that? Because I had the option. Remember the definition Caitlin read. I had the unearned right to choose whether or not I noticed if I was the only related to race and ethnicity. It wasn't until I went to Springfield College in Massachusetts when I recognized what it felt like, when I recognized that I didn't have the privilege there of being a member of the racial ethnic majority. When I go home to Hawaii, it's almost as if I can relax. For those of you that don't know, I live in Chicago, Illinois now, and I travel all around the continental United States for work. And I'm always sort of on edge, if I'm honest, and I'm being really transparent and vulnerable with you. I always am aware if I'm the only Asian in the room, if I'm the only Asian male in the room. I have a heightened sensitivity if I feel like someone is speaking more loudly to me or speaking as if English may perceptually not be my first language. I have a very, I call it my inclusion Achilles heel. If I go to a restaurant or a movie theater, or even while I'm checking in line at United Airlines sometimes, and I feel like I might be treated differently because of my racial ethnic identity, I'm always on edge. I am very keenly aware that I am not a member of the racial majority, and I am also very aware of perceptually what I see others who are a member of the racial majority in the continental U.S., those that I may place a label on as Caucasian or white, or looking like they may identify with that very broad and diverse community. I will sometimes place a sense of frustration that I have to, from my lens, sometimes work harder because I stand out more. If I'm in a room full of folks that are not of the same racial identity as me, I stand out. People will remember my name, or if I say something that's off kilter, there's more risk that it may harm me more. And sometimes I'm seen as speaking for my demographic. In the Y right now, I often connect with a colleague who's a CEO. She is a Japanese American CEO of a Y, and she and I often joke that, one of the things we're keenly aware is if we screw up, that may not just be our own careers that we are affecting, but could that be something that, because we are without privilege when it comes to race and ethnicity in the context of our work, affects the chances of others who look like us, who identify with the same racial or ethnic groups as us, from having the roles that we currently have now. Those are just some examples of how privilege related to some of the core, secondary, and organizational dimensions of diversity really do manifest. And again, I want to put a disclaimer. Everything that I'm sharing is very much related to my own personal experience. I happen to be the Director of Diversity and Inclusion for YUSA, but I also happen to be a human. And this concept of privilege is one that absolutely informs how we lead, how we serve, how we engage, but also deeply personal. We need to be aware of that as we move forward. So I want us to zero in quickly on the core dimensions of diversity and just ask yourself, and Caitlin, I'm going to ask you if you can sort of help me out here a little bit. But for Caitlin and I, for those of you that have met both of us or check out our wonderful pictures on the Elevate website, right, Caitlin? How or where does privilege manifest in each of these core dimensions? And based on who you are you with or without privilege with regard to sexual orientation, with regard to national origin and birthplace, with regard to race, with regard to language use and native tongue, with regard to economic background, ethnicity, heritage, and cultural background, diverse ability and mental health, age, faith, beliefs, values, and ideology, and gender identity. Let's take age as an example. Right, depending on the situations and environments we find ourselves in, sometimes being of a younger age group does put us in a place of privilege, or in others, it's being a member of an older age group. Okay, so again, it's situational. And then when we take the concept of intersectionality and layer perhaps age with gender, so let's say being male identified over the age of 50 and perceptually Caucasian or white, does that then mean that our layers of intersectionality give us greater privilege than someone who may be over the age of 50, Caucasian identified or white identified and female? Do you see what I'm saying? So that is really what we're looking at here. So some questions to ask, and I did forget to put the citation here. This comes from a really powerful article that my colleague Safia Fauzi found. So if you are interested, please do not credit me or the Y for this. I will get you the citation. But there's some questions to think about. Diversity asks us who's in the room. Equity responds, who's trying to get into the room but can't, and whose presence in the room is under constant threat of erasure. Powerful, right? Inclusion asks, has everyone's idea been heard? Justice responds, whose ideas won't be taken as seriously because they aren't in the majority. I'll tell you, I've been in many meetings on whether my perception of the reality is in alignment with the actual reality or not. I'll let that be up to the eye of the beholder. But I've had many conversations with white or Caucasian identified colleagues who help as an advocate for me, because sometimes in certain meetings, not all, but in some, I'll share an idea and I'll get no response from anyone in the room, as sometimes the only person of color in the room. And then one of my Caucasian colleagues will say the same thing, and everyone's jumping all over, jumping up and down. That's a great idea, right? And I realize that in some contexts, it's simply because of how I communicate or because of how I perceptually appear, that perhaps people are literally not hearing me because I'm not a member of the majority. Okay? The last one here is diversity asks, how many more of whatever group, and you can fill in whatever minority or marginalized population, the LGBTQ community, people of color, people with diverse abilities, women, younger and older folks, depending on the dynamic, people of diverse faith, and so on. All right? And so if diversity asks how many more of this group do we have this year than last, equity responds, what conditions have we created that maintain certain groups as the perpetual majority here? How are the concepts of privilege and power connected? Human nature is such that when we have privilege, it equates to power, and when we have power, we don't want to give it up. I'm honest with myself, that is something I also need to be keenly aware of. I realize that although I'm an Asian American, I am male identified, and I have a position that gives me great privilege and also a certain amount of power and influence. And I need to be aware of that in the context of the conversations that I have with so many colleagues who may not be in positions of privilege and power quite such as I. Now, we talked about equity and equality. I think by this point, everyone has a pretty clear definition of the difference between the two. I will just pause here, take a breath, a sip of water here, and also ask you to look at this graphic and really for yourself familiarize yourself with the difference between these two concepts, equity and equality. And you really might be thinking, all right, so now that we've talked about how privilege affects both those with and without power, what do we do with this? So as we dive into this, I want to share with you an example. At YMCA of the USA, we have a strong partnership and collaboration with the People's Institute that provides a workshop called Undoing Institutional Racism. And one of the things that I personally gleaned from that workshop and that training, which was so powerful, was a definition of race. And I'm going to link race to privilege for a second, because the title of this session is How Privilege Affects Those With and Those Without. Let's talk about race, right? Race, through one definition, is defined as a dehumanizing socio-political geographic construct utilized to categorize one group of people from another. It's a construct that dehumanizes everyone. Let's link that to privilege. Privilege is a concept that whether you are on the end of having privilege or on the end of not having it, it is something that affects everyone. It colors and informs who we go and sit next to in meetings. If this conference were not virtual, if we're all sitting in one of those wonderful hotel conference rooms, it informs whom we would be more likely to listen to if they got up on stage or not. Whom would we walk next to if we're walking on the street, or might we clutch our wallets or our pockets or our purses if someone of a certain demographic walked across the street? Privilege is connected to bias and informs our access to power, which of course enables us to advance equity either organizationally, institutionally, or societally or not. And this framework helps us, if you're interested, to take a look at how we can begin to unpack our policies, practices, procedures, and programs in the context of the institutions, organizations, or companies that we serve. Again, please go back to the other virtual workshop that I put together if you are interested in taking a deeper dive into this framework, because we're running up on the end of time here. Lastly, the guiding principles to navigate privilege are very similar to the guiding principles to navigate equity, and that's what they are here. Be aware of one's own privilege, and toward that end, lead with empathy in all interactions and activities. Recognize and value and embrace all dimensions of diversity, and work toward the greatest possible of inclusion, keeping in mind the privilege that you may have or not have. Foster safe exchange of ideas, beliefs, and perspectives within and through your organization, locally and globally, and also advance social equity and bridge building across and within all communities. So with that, thank you so much for your time. It's been an amazing session. I do wish I could see all your faces and hopefully read you and you, gauge whether or not you found this to be impactful. You do have my Twitter handle there, my email address at the bottom of the screen. I am at your service. If there's anything more that we can do at the YMCA, we always seek to learn, seek to serve, and seek to grow with all of you. With that, I'll toss it back to my good friend, Caitlin.
Thanks so much, as always, Chad, for that session on privilege. We have a few more live sessions coming up this afternoon, so please join us for our next two sessions, and don't forget to join us for our closing session with Paul Schmitz, the CEO of Leading Inside Out. Thanks again, Chad, and everyone enjoy the last couple of sessions of this amazing conference.